Thank you. Hey, it's great to be here again, and I'm recognising more and more faces, which is brilliant, which is really good. Just on that sort of youth work note, as was shared by Chris, it is a fact that young people will be our church leaders of tomorrow. But of course, biblically, they're meant to be a part of the church today. But the truth is, if they're not part of the church today, they won't be our church leaders tomorrow. And so getting them as part of our church, and I know you've got a heart for this, is so, so important. And that does lead into, as I want to start, because I was on the phone the other week with somebody who was one of my old young people. I've known them since the heady days of year 6. For those of you that don't know, that's when they're sort of getting a bit big for their boots and they're desperate to head off to secondary school. And secondary school starts in year 7. And youth work in a church, youth ministry, is quite strange because the young people, children, move up into youth work, into year 7. And then as a youth minister, you have an extremely close and intense relationship with them for about 5 or 6 years. And then they go off and you often don't see them again. But for those 5 or 6 years, you're, as a youth team, as a youth pastor, you're really important. Because those are the years where they're finding out who they are, where perhaps they're pushing back against their families a little bit. And so good, solid relationship with adults that are worthy of trust is really important. But anyway, I've got this phone call from this girl who I knew. She'd been part of my youth work. And it was about 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. And she, at this time of year, like a lot of young people, she'd headed off to university. And she'd gone off with real hope and possibility. It's that culmination of GCSEs and then A-levels. And we pushed them to university, a lot of them into the big wide world. But what happens when the joy of setting up your university room and putting up the photos and the lights, what happens when that ends? Your mum and dad go home and you start feeling lonely. And what happens when you are trying so hard to live the Christian life that you end up being isolated and ignored by your peers? What happens when you're not invited out on a Saturday night to the parties because they think you wouldn't approve? And this is the phone call I was having with this girl. She'd come all the way through my youth group and was a Christian young person, desperately trying to live for God, and was going to university, ready to live for God. And she said these words to me. She said, "Matt, it wasn't meant to be like this." And those words have stuck with me, really, for the past few weeks. Now, of course, none of you here, I guess, are planning on heading off to university sometime soon. But maybe those words have been in your head and in your heart at some point. Matt, it wasn't meant to be like this. Because I can guarantee, sooner or later, it's going to happen to you. Sooner or later, something will occur that will rock your world. Sometimes we get a forewarning, and sometimes it just explodes beneath our feet. But we'll all take our turn with it. We'll all have that moment where our life seems to go from 0 to panic attack in seconds. And our world is turned upside down. And in that moment, the question is, what do we do? When the crisis hits, when it all seems to come tumbling down, what are we going to do? And some of you here, as I'm speaking, you're remembering because it's already happened to you. Maybe the divorce paper was presented. Maybe there was a stillborn child. Maybe it was a discovery of an affair. Maybe it was redundancy or a cancer diagnosis. Maybe the telephone has rung and you've no idea what is about to happen in your life. And after you say hello, the caller tells you some news and you stand there in mind-numbing disbelief. Maybe you hear an ambulance siren, and it's getting louder and louder, and then you realise it's heading to your house. And things that were important a moment before seem irrelevant now. And as I said, some of you are remembering that moment. Maybe it was a crisis of your own making. Maybe you gave in to some temptation and thought the grass was greener on the other side, and you did something you'd regret, and you just wish you could turn the clock back and make a different decision. Some of you won't have had that gut-ripping experience yet, but it will happen. Very few go through life without it. It's so gut-wrenching that you can't breathe. And at those times, we need something rock solid, thing that will not change, that will not be shaken, that will not be turned upside down. And we need that nailed down, really, before the crisis begins. Have you got that overarching command or thought that controls your every dimension of life? To be able to say, as the psalmist did, "The Lord, He is God." Pure and simple. Because saying we believe in God, any God actually, is no big deal. Over the years, the polls have said, in the Western world, about 85% of people still say they believe in God. But of course, saying we believe in God and trusting in God are two very, very different things. And when we push to the edge of our comfort zone, the claim to just believe in God is really hollow. But to say the Lord, He is God, is something very different. I'm going to take you into a passage of the Bible that you may well know quite well, especially if you're used to being in church. There's this man called Isaiah, and he faced a personal crisis like I've just explained to you. And his testimony and his actions show a man who had the truth nailed down. The Lord, He is God. Let's take a look. Oh, it's not come up. Thank you. Let's take a look at the passage that should just be coming. There should be a passage, I think, just next couple. There we go. In Isaiah chapter 6, it says this. "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. They were calling to one another, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory.' And at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke." Now, for us sitting here, it might not seem like a personal earth-shattering crisis that Isaiah has just faced, but it was. King Uzziah ruled over Judah, which is the southern part of the kingdom at this point, and he'd ruled for 52 years, bringing stability to the region. But now King Uzziah is dead. Don't read that too casually. This was a nightmare moment happening to Isaiah. Isaiah's written, in case you're wondering, about 700 or 800 years before Jesus. And that makes it nearly 3,000 years old. But it's still relevant today because of Isaiah's response. In fact, if you're interested in history, it's one of the most historically attested Old Testament books that there are. If you know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls were a collection of manuscripts that were found in 1946. They were found by a Bedouin shepherd boy. He was throwing stones in the desert, and he threw them into a cave, and he heard the sound of pottery cracking. And he went in, found some stone jars, and in those jars were lots and lots of manuscripts, many of which were biblical Old Testament accounts. And within that was a complete copy of the book of Isaiah. about 1,000 years older than our previous copy at that point. And to all intents and purposes, it was exactly the same as the copies we'd got. And like most biblical writers, Isaiah is this humble man who grew up in the palace. He grew up as the grandson of King Joash, and therefore was probably, almost certainly, cousin of King Uzziah here. Isaiah was King Uzziah's, names are very similar, but cousin. And so he's now confronted with the death of his friend, his cousin, his relation, and his king. And the throne has now become vacant at the worst possible time. Rumours of the mighty Assyrian neighbours rising to power had been circulating for years. Sort of rumours of the armies spreading, rumours of armies marching. And suddenly the throne has become vacant and the vultures are circling. Everyone would have been on their social media apps trying to find out what's happening with Assyria. They'd have been checking all the news apps. Dread and terror would have been rising in every citizen's heart. Isaiah's world was falling apart. But then he saw God for who he was, and he never mentions his king again. And so we're going to discover in a little bit what he did, how he knew that God was his foundation. And maybe when our life is falling apart too, we can think on this. Because number one, we find that God is alive. King Uzziah is dead, but God lives on. Psalm 90 says, before the mountains were born, you gave birth to the earth. You are God. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, it says. There's not a single head of state in our world who will be there in 50 years' time. Boris Johnson, he's gone. Rishi Sunak probably hasn't got that long to last. The woman whose name we can barely remember, she's gone. You know, the turnover in world leadership is 100%. Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, Kim Jong-un, they'll all be gone. In 100 years, nobody on this planet that is alive now will be alive. We'll have 10 billion brand new people on this planet. Most of us probably will be forgotten, but not God. He didn't have a beginning, which means he depends on nothing and no one. He always has been and always will be. And that's the foundation for Isaiah. When everyone else is promoting themselves for the throne to see what they can get out of it for 10 brief years, Isaiah says, no, our thought is bigger than this. God is alive. But don't forget, he saw the Lord seated on a throne, which means God is not just alive, but God is in charge. There's never been a vision of God which sort of catches God off guard. There's never been a glimpse of heaven where we see God sitting down with his feet up. You know, heaven is not coming apart at the seams. It's not barely holding against its attackers. It's not under construction. Nobody in heaven is sort of caught unawares with their underwear still on the radiator when a visitor comes around. And it doesn't work like that. God is alive, but he's also in charge. He's sitting on a throne. And the throne describes his right to rule the world. We don't give God authority over our lives. We don't make him Lord. He is the Lord. And he exercises his authority whether we like it or not. And Isaiah's crisis, and yours and mine, are not beyond God's scope of lordship. And it's a high and mighty throne, don't forget. It's a throne above all others, because not only is God alive, not only is he in charge, but he is all powerful. The throne of his authority is not one amongst many. It's high and lifted up. That is a picture signifying his ultimate all power. Later on in Isaiah it says, my plans will take place and I will do my will. He does what he wants with the armies of heaven and the inhabitants of earth. And he is also resplendent and revered. I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. His robe fills the temple. I'm sure you've seen photos or films of a bride in the temple with long flowing train out behind them. Maybe you even had it at your wedding, a long train. Did you know that's a picture of something? The longer the train, the more worthy you are meant to be, apparently. We've seen pictures of royal weddings, haven't we, with trains that seem to stretch right down the aisle. What would it mean if the bridal train filled all the aisles and covered all the seats? It says his robe fills the temple. And seraphim were standing above him with 6 wings, 2 covering face, 2 covering his feet, 2 they flew. And nobody quite knows what these strange 6-winged creatures with feet and eyes and intelligence actually are. They never appear again in the Bible until Revelation. But they're obviously part of the angelic host. And given the grandeur of the scene and the power, don't picture chubby little babies fluttering around. These are mighty, extraordinary angelic beings. When one of them speaks, the foundations of the doorways shake. There's no puny, silly creatures in heaven, only magnificent ones. And even they cannot look upon the Lord. They cover their eyes. Even they do not feel worthy to leave their feet exposed in his presence. They cover their feet. Great and good as they are, angels hide in holy fear and reverence from the face of God. And I don't know who you are in real life outside of this building. Monday morning may see you as a CEO of some great Fortune 500 company, I don't know. You may be a man or woman of great power and responsibility. There may be people hustling around you to get your attention and to shake your hand. You might even become a celebrity or a world leader, I don't know. But you're this small in comparison to the Lord of heaven. And that is good, because Isaiah describes God not only as in charge and all-powerful and resplendent and revered. He says God is holy. Holy, holy, holy. Holy is a word that actually brings us to the brink of the English language, really. It's experience of God almost beyond words. I don't know if you know this, I might have shared it before, but in the Hebrew language, the Old Testament language, you can't have superlatives. So that's things like nice, nicer, nicest. You can't have that in the Hebrew language. It just doesn't exist. So if they want to create that moreness, they repeat the word. So instead of nice, nicer, they would have nice, nice. Here, God is described as holy, holy, holy. The only time in the Bible where it's repeated 3 times. Until you get to Revelation, where this Isaiah passage is actually repeated again. The only time in the Bible where it's repeated 3 times is God's holiness. Complete. You cannot get more holy than God. And holy is a word which means to cut off or to separate or to put to one side. Holy is a God-type word. Things can be holy. The Bible speaks of holy ground and holy temples and holy nations, holy men, holy women, holy cities. But only because they're separated and committed to God. Isaiah at this moment, his filthiness and incompetence was exposed before God's holiness. And that's true for us too. We might not like the words, but our sin and our fallen state is exposed before a holy God. God is pure, he's righteous, and he's holy. He's incomparable. He's divine and he is great. And maybe there are times where we should be a bit more like the seraphim angel who cover our eyes and cover our feet and bow down. And in fact, you get to a point where language runs out. As Habakkuk says, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let everyone on earth be silent in his presence. Because words can't really do it justice. But God's holiness means something in his relationship with you and I. Isaiah's response is one we can understand, really. I mean, I guess we could just ignore it and carry on as much of the world does. Maybe we can fall into the trap of just trying harder to be a bit more holy. But of course, we can never do that. We could trust our own abilities, or we can mirror Isaiah's response when he said, "Woe is me." Faced with that kind of holiness, Isaiah said, "Woe is me, I'm ruined, I'm a man of unclean lips." How awful would it have been if the passage had stopped there? I'm a man of unclean lips. Full stop. End of passage. How awful would it have been if God had left us in the state where he is holy, we are unclean, we're a people of unclean lips, and there's nothing we can do about it? How awful would that have been? Yet God doesn't leave him in that place. He doesn't leave him struggling in the realization of his own sin. God does something, and his guilt is taken away and his sin atoned for. A live coal is taken. And in Old Testament temples, they had live fire burning all the time with red hot coals to signify this. Red hot coal is taken to cleanse his lips. It's a really powerful picture, isn't it, for somebody who would grow into becoming a prophet and a preacher, as Isaiah did, that his lips, his very words, are cleansed by God. I often do this when I'm sort of driving. I think, what if? We often think of this passage purely as a vision. And of course it was a vision. But what if it really happened? Maybe Isaiah went on as a prophet and a preacher with scarred lips. Because whenever you meet with God, forever you are changed. And after this experience, Isaiah meets with God and his lips are touched. His words are cleansed, but of course his sinful life is cleansed. God's holiness pointed to his sinfulness, but God didn't leave him in that and provided a way out, which is what he does for us too. This is where we see God's sovereign grace. Isaiah didn't ask for it. He was too trapped up in his own sin. He thought all was lost, but God's grace provided a way out. It atoned for his sin. Atone is one of those strange biblical words. It really means to make amends for or to make reparation. In 2,000 years forward, Jesus' death and resurrection meant we no longer need altars and sacrifices and burnt offerings and tongs and hot coals in order to be cleansed. But our sin still needs to be atoned for. And on him, in him, our sin was laid. It was atoned once and for all. And in atoning, he makes us one with God again. If you ever forget, just break the word down. At one meant atonement. The atonement means we can now be at one with God again. The at one meant. And notice the effect it has on Isaiah. He says, woe is me, but then when his sin is taken away, he hears the question, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And it's like Isaiah is saying here, send me. When we know what it's like to have our guilt taken away, all we can do is say, here am I, send me. But his experience of the holiness of God would always keep him humble. And I don't know if you've noticed that pattern as we've gone through the story. There's God's holiness, our sinfulness, God's grace, and our service. That's the story of the Christian life. When we recognize the holiness of God, we're then faced with our sinfulness. But we're not left in our sinfulness. We meet the grace of God. And the only response to the grace of God is for us to say, here am I, send me. And so as we move into sort of conclusion, because of who God was when Isaiah heard that call, he said, here am I, send me. And do you hear that call inside you? Whom shall I send? God says, and we say, here am I, send me. You're probably sitting there thinking, well, yeah, but you know, I'm a bit old and I've done my task, or I'm in this place and I can't do anything different. Matt, I already know where he's sending me. And it comes full circle to the beginning, to this girl I was talking to on the phone when she's at university. And she's saying, Matt, it wasn't meant to be like this. And I talked it through with her. I said, God is still God. The God you were praising and worshipping at Summer Madness a few weeks before is still the same God. He's still in his throne room. And he's still sending you. I explained to her that I don't think God was that interested in sending you to the place, to Birmingham University. He's sending you to the people of Birmingham University. He's sending you to minister to the people you meet in and around university, to your housemates who at the moment are ignoring you, to your hall, to the college staff, to the cleaners who clean the kitchen and your room who you barely know their name of unless you make the effort to learn it, to the staff who set up the lecture halls, to the kitchen staff who cook the meals, to the lady in the Tesco's opposite in whom you buy your milk and bread from. That's who he's sending you to minister to. And as I said to her, before they see Jesus as a blessing, maybe they need to see you as a blessing. And so I expand that out to us here. Maybe it's time for us to see everything and everyone filled with an ordinary glory. Maybe it's time to see our commission, as Isaiah had a commission, our commission to commission hairdressers and Uber drivers and engineers and coffee shop baristas and homemakers, filmmakers, lawyers, doctors, the unemployed, the retired, wherever you find yourself at this moment, God wants you to say, here am I, send me. Maybe he's anointing you to that circle of people that only you have influence with. I work for the Anglican Church and I'm always pushing. Maybe it's time to ordain the ordinary. Recognizing that we're all called and all commissioned to represent God in our corner of the world, whatever that may be. Maybe we should all stand and say, here I am, send me. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.